right, so get this. We're diving into something pretty wild today. You sent us this piece.
Yeah.
A fictional story about Trump winning a second term. Not consecutively, obviously, but still wild to even think about.
It's definitely thought-provoking. It goes beyond Trump himself, though, right? It digs into how, like, political systems, the media, even just societal trends, how all of that can lead to outcomes we might not have expected.
Exactly. So this piece, we're looking at excerpts from a longer piece. It paints this picture of a dystopian kind of near future, where Trump pulls a Grover Cleveland and gets a second shot at the presidency.
And it jumps right in, too. The author describes Trump's second inaugural address as predictably vile and puts the blame for his return squarely on the Obama and Biden administrations.
Wow. Okay, so that's a pretty bold claim. Why does the author think those administrations are responsible for Trump round two?
So the author argues that Obama's response back in 2008 to the financial crisis, particularly his embracing of what they call neoliberal policies, really set the stage for Trump's initial rise.
So for someone who's not totally familiar with that term, can you break down what neoliberal policies means in this context?
Sure. So basically it refers to a set of economic policies that emphasize free markets, deregulation, privatization. And the argument is that these policies, while maybe intended to stabilize the economy, they actually ended up kind of making inequality worse, creating this sense of economic anxiety among certain groups of people, a sentiment that Trump was then able to tap into.
Right. So they're saying Obama's policies unintentionally created the perfect breeding ground for Trump's brand of populism.
Exactly. And then they go on to suggest that Biden, even after seeing what happened with Trump's first term, didn't do enough to address those underlying issues or prevent history from repeating itself.
Yeah, that's a pretty scathing critique of both administrations, for sure. But the author then shifts gears. Instead of dwelling on those broad political arguments, they zoom in on a really specific event. The Gaza ceasefire, Trump, of course, takes all the credit, but the author implies that it was actually pressure from the incoming administration that was the key factor. So why do you think they brought up this example? What are they trying to highlight?
I think it serves a couple purposes. One, it shows how easily facts can be manipulated, spun for political gain. But also, it subtly sets the stage for what kind of foreign policy we might expect from Trump in this fictional second term. One where he prioritizes making deals, even if it means overlooking human rights concerns.
Okay, you bring up a good point about those deals. The article mentions a potential Saudi-Israeli agreement, right?
Yeah, and the author seems to suggest that Trump might be willing to make concessions to certain regimes to get what he sees as a win, regardless of the long-term consequences.
So right from the get-go, it's clear the author is not holding back on their opinion of Trump. They call him a rapist, reference the Stormy Daniels case, the hush money scandal, and even point out the irony of a felon leading the U.S. while many convicted of similar crimes can't even vote. What's your take on the author's choice of words here?
Yeah, they're definitely not mincing words. I think the author is intentionally using provocative language to kind of shock the reader and challenge any lingering sympathy for Trump. They're directly attacking his moral authority, highlighting the hypocrisy in the justice system, reminding us of the serious allegations he's faced.
Right. For those who might not remember all the details, can you quickly remind us what happened with that Stormy Daniels case and those legal charges?
Sure. So Stormy Daniels, an adult film actress, alleged she had an affair with Trump years ago and that he paid her hush money to keep quiet about it during the 2016 election. It led to a whole legal battle with Trump facing multiple charges related to campaign finance violations and other issues. Many of those were eventually dropped after he became president, but the hush money charge remained, although it didn't result in any actual penalties.
Right. So it's almost like the author is using this fictional scenario to hold up a mirror to our current reality and ask some really uncomfortable questions about power accountability and whether the legal system really applies equally to everyone.
Absolutely. And the author doesn't stop there. The story then jumps into Trump's first day back in office, and it's this whirlwind of policy reversals and actions that seem designed to appeal to his base, but will probably just divide the nation even more. He immediately cracks down on undocumented immigrants, declares emergencies on both the southern border and for energy, and pushes for more oil and gas drilling.
It's interesting how the author uses these very specific actions to tap into those very real anxieties that people have about another Trump term. Immigration and climate change are obviously huge issues, and the story seems to be playing on those fears, especially when they mention things like Los Angeles still smoldering from wildfires.
Yeah, those vivid images really drive home the potential impact of these policy decisions, especially on marginalized communities and the environment. It's like the author is saying, if we let this happen again, these are the consequences we're facing.
And then things take a turn for the truly bizarre. The story talks about Trump wanting to take back the Panama Canal, rename the Gulf of Mexico, and even plant the American flag on Mars.
Nice.
It almost feels satirical, like something out of a political cartoon.
There's definitely an element of satire there, but I think it's also a way for the author to highlight the potential dangers of unchecked power and impulsive decision-making. It raises the question, where are the limits of executive power? And if we don't hold our leaders accountable, what's to stop them from pursuing these outlandish and potentially harmful ambitions?
And it's not just Trump acting alone, right? The author mentions that he surrounds himself with these equally immoral underlings from Fox News and Congress. It paints a pretty bleak picture of the entire political system, suggesting that the problem goes way beyond just one man.
You're absolutely right. The author seems to be arguing that there's this whole ecosystem of enablers and collaborators who are complicit in this erosion of democratic norms and values, and they highlight this further with their use of presidential pardons.
Oh, how so?
Well, both the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration use pardons to protect their own. Biden focuses on the Biden family, and Trump targets those involved in the January 6th Capitol riot.
That's such a clever way to illustrate the corruption and self-dealing that can happen on both sides. It suggests that the problem isn't just one party or ideology, but a systemic issue that affects the entire political landscape.
Exactly. And by portraying it so starkly in this fictional setting, the author forces us to confront the potential for this kind of corruption to become even more entrenched if we don't hold our leaders accountable.
It's a sobering thought for sure, but before we get too bogged down in the negativity, I want to jump back to something you mentioned earlier, the author's use of satire. The story obviously includes some pretty outlandish scenarios, but it also seems to be using humor as a way to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Do you think that approach is effective?
I think it can be, especially when you're dealing with a topic as sensitive and potentially polarizing as the second Trump term. Humor can be a way to disarm the reader, get them to lower their guard and consider perspectives they might otherwise dismiss. And it can also be a really powerful tool for social commentary. It allows the author to critique powerful figures and institutions without coming across as preachy or overly serious.
Right, it's like a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Exactly. By using humor, the author can make some pretty pointed critiques about American politics and society without alienating readers who might not agree with their perspective.
So we've talked about the author's critique of Trump, the political system, even broader societal trends. But there's one element that I think is worth exploring a bit more. The role of the media in this fictional world. The story mentions immoral underlings from Fox News, and there are these hints that the media is complicit in Trump's rise and potentially even actively contributing to the spread of misinformation and propaganda. What kind of message do you think the author is sending about the media's role in shaping public opinion and influencing political outcomes?
I think it's a very deliberate critique of the current media landscape.
Yeah.
The author seems to be suggesting that a media environment that's dominated by outlets that prioritize sensationalism, partisan agendas, and profit over factual reporting that can create fertile ground for demagoguery and erode public trust in democratic institutions.
It's almost like they're saying that a healthy democracy needs a free and independent press, one that holds power accountable and provides accurate information to the public. But if the media is compromised, then the whole system is vulnerable to manipulation and abuse.
Exactly. The author may be drawing parallels to real-world concerns about the spread of misinformation, the rise of echo chambers, and the decline of trust in traditional news sources.
That's a chilling thought, and brings us to the author's concluding remarks about an uncertain future. They quote Ielts, saying, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." And then leave us with this open-ended statement, what tomorrow may bring for the U.S. and the world remains unwritten. What do you think the author is trying to convey with that ending?
It's a powerful ending that leaves you with a sense of unease and uncertainty. I think it's a call to action disguised as a warning. The author is reminding us that the future is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make both individually and collectively. By highlighting the dangers of complacency and inaction, they're urging us to engage in critical thinking, challenge harmful narratives, and actively participate in shaping a more just and equitable future.
It's like they're saying, here's a glimpse of what could happen. Now what are you going to do about it?
Exactly.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding democracy and defending the values we hold dear.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about the author's critique of Trump, the political system, the role of the media, and the importance of active citizenship. But the story also hints at some pretty unsettling global implications of a second Trump term, particularly when it comes to foreign policy and the potential for increased conflict and instability. Let's take a closer look at those aspects in the next part of our deep dive.
You're right, the potential global impact is pretty unsettling. It's like the author is sketching out this world that's teetering on the edge, and Trump's actions are kind of pushing it closer to the brink.
Yeah, what strikes me is how the story contrasts Trump's seemingly positive move, that potential deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel, with these other actions that feel way more aggressive and isolationist, like taking back the Panama Canal. It's almost like two totally different foreign policies clashing with each other.
It's a really interesting point. I think the author is playing with that tension on purpose. To highlight how unpredictable and contradictory Trump's approach to foreign policy can be. On the one hand, he wants to be seen as this master dealmaker, the guy who can bring even sworn enemies together. But on the other hand, he's driven by this need to assert American dominance, even if it means alienating allies or undermining global institutions.
It makes you wonder what kind of message those mixed signals would send to the rest of the world. Would other countries see the U.S. as a reliable partner, or as this unpredictable force that they need to be wary of?
Exactly. That's the danger. The story hints that a second Trump term could mean a shift away from multilateralism and cooperation towards a more unilateral America First approach. And that could embolden other authoritarian leaders, weaken international institutions like the UN, and potentially lead to more conflict and instability around the world.
So it's like the author is suggesting that a second Trump term could actually bring about an era of global chaos and uncertainty. And we see hints of that chaos in the story itself, with that reference to Los Angeles still smoldering. It's not hard to imagine how environmental disasters, fueled by climate change, could make global instability even worse and lead to more conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The story doesn't get into the specifics of what those conflicts might look like, but it definitely paints this picture of a world where tensions are running high and the possibility of conflict is always there.
Yeah.
And with Trump at the helm, seemingly more interested in making deals than actually promoting diplomacy or addressing the root causes of these conflicts, it's easy to see how things could boil over.
It's like a cautionary tale reminding us how interconnected all these global issues are and how the actions of one nation can have ripple effects around the world. But the story doesn't just focus on the international stage, right? It also explores this potential erosion of democratic norms and institutions here at home.
Exactly. It's like this double-edged sword with Trump's fictional presidency impacting both domestic and international affairs. We see this erosion of democratic norms in the story through his crackdown on dissent, his consolidation of power, his disregard for the rule of law. It's this chilling reminder of how fragile democracy can be and how quickly it can be undermined when those in power are willing to exploit its weaknesses for their own gain.
And the story doesn't shy away from portraying that erosion in very concrete terms. We see it in the actions of Trump and his allies, but also in the way ordinary people are impacted. Their freedoms restricted, their rights curtailed, their voices silenced.
Right. It's not just some abstract concept. The story makes it very real, very personal, and raises the question, if this were to happen in real life, what could ordinary citizens do to resist that kind of erosion of democratic norms? How do you fight back against a system that seems rigged against you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while the story doesn't offer any easy answers, it does seem to suggest that complacency and inaction are not options. We can't just sit back and watch as our democracy is dismantled. We need to be actively engaged in defending democratic values, holding our leaders accountable, and demanding a more just and equitable society.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation from all of us. It requires us to be informed, to engage in civic discourse, to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable.
And it's about recognizing the warning signs, right? Not dismissing them as hyperbole or exaggeration. This fictional account might be extreme, but it's rooted in real concerns about the direction our country is heading in.
Absolutely. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to be vigilant and proactive in defending the principles of democracy and making sure that our institutions remain strong and resilient.
This conversation has been really thought-provoking so far. We've covered the potential global impact of a second Trump term, the erosion of democratic norms, and the role of citizens in safeguarding democracy. But before we move on, I want to touch on something that's been kind of lurking in the background of this whole story, the role of technology.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it's definitely there. We see it in the mention of Elon Musk celebrating Trump's ambition to plant the American flag on Mars. It kind of speaks to the growing influence of these private companies in space exploration and how technological advancements could be used for nationalistic agendas.
It makes you think about the broader implications of technology in this fictional world, right? It's like a double-edged sword. On one hand, technology has this potential to connect people, spread information, empower individuals. But on the other hand, it can be used to make existing inequalities worse, concentrate power, and even erode democratic values.
Exactly. And if we connect that back to the author's critique of those tech oligarchs during the Biden administration, it raises questions about who actually controls these powerful technologies and whether they're truly accountable to the public. Are they driven by profit and self-interest, or are they committed to using their power for the greater good?
It's a question that's becoming more and more relevant in our own world as we're dealing with the impact of social media, artificial intelligence, and all these other emerging technologies. And it's a question that the story seems to be grappling with as well.
Definitely. The story doesn't give us any easy answers, but it does force us to confront the complex and often contradictory ways that technology is shaping our world.
And in the context of this fictional second Trump term, it's particularly unsettling to think about how these technologies might be used to further consolidate power, suppress dissent, manipulate public opinion.
Right, think about the author's portrayal of that media landscape dominated by outlets like Fox News. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where social media algorithms just reinforce those echo chambers, making it even harder for people to access different perspectives and have meaningful conversations.
And it's not just social media either, right? We're seeing all these advances in artificial intelligence surveillance technologies, data collection that could be used to monitor citizens, control information, and suppress dissent. It's a pretty dystopian vision, but it feels disturbingly plausible.
It does, doesn't it? The story might be fictional, but it reflects very real anxieties about the potential for technology to be used for authoritarian ends. And it raises some crucial questions about what we can do to make sure the technology is used responsibly and ethically instead of becoming a tool of oppression.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to the question of hope. Is there any room for hope in this fictional account, or is it all doom and gloom?
That's a tough one. I think there is a glimmer of hope, but it's fragile. It lies in the author's implicit call to action. By highlighting the potential consequences of inaction, they're reminding us that we actually have the power to shape a different future. It's up to us to choose whether we give in to despair or rise to the challenge and fight for a better world.
Okay, so we've talked about how this fictional second Trump term could shake things up globally, and even weaken democracy here at home. But there's this other layer I find really interesting, how the story brings in technology. It's not always in your face, but it's definitely there under the surface.
Oh yeah, it's like this underlying sense of unease about how tech fits into this whole dystopian picture. We see it with that bit about Elon Musk celebrating Trump wanting to plant the American flag on Mars. Like, private companies are becoming more about nationalistic competition than actual scientific advancement.
Yeah, and that brings up some uncomfortable questions. Is the author saying that the people in control of these powerful technologies, the big tech companies, the innovators, are they accountable to anyone or just to themselves?
It does make you think back to how the author criticized those tech oligarchs during the Biden years. It's like they're saying even with a supposedly more moderate leader in charge, those powerful forces were already a worry. So under Trump again, would it become even worse?
Especially with how the story shows us the media landscape. If we're already worried about things like algorithms creating echo chambers and all the misinformation, imagine that amplified under someone more authoritarian.
It's not hard to picture those algorithms being used to silence people who disagree or to push certain stories.
Yeah.
And then you've got AI-powered propaganda deepfakes, making it hard to tell what's real and what's not.
It's kind of scary. And it's not just about manipulating information online. What about things like facial recognition for surveillance or the government having tons of personal data?
All real concerns that the story hints at. It creates this unsettling picture of a future where technology is a weapon in the hands of those in power, whether for political control or social engineering.
And it's not just governments either, right? We see powerful tech companies already throwing their weight around influencing elections, shaping public opinion. It's like we're in this weird zone where it's hard to tell where corporations end and governments begin.
And when you have someone like Trump back in charge, someone who doesn't care much for rules or institutions, that blurriness becomes even more dangerous. Who do you hold accountable when the people controlling the technology weren't even elected?
So what's the takeaway for us listening? In the face of all this potential tech trouble, how do we make sure it's used for good and not for control and oppression?
That's the big question we all need to be asking. It starts with being aware, understanding the risks and demanding transparency from both governments and companies.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and let technology happen to us. We have to be informed citizens asking the tough questions. Who benefits from this? Who's being left out? And what kind of future are we making if we don't speak up?
It's about pushing for better regulations, ethical guidelines, and making sure there's democratic oversight so these powerful tools are used the right way. And in the end, it's about remembering that technology is just a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It's our choice.
This has been a wild ride, diving deep into this fictional take on a second Trump term. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for the listener?
I think it's that reminder that the future isn't set in stone. This story is a cautionary tale, but it also shows us that we have the power to change things, whether it's through getting involved in politics, demanding better from our leaders, or being thoughtful about how we use technology. We all have a part to play.
It's a call to action hidden within a fictional story. And even if this specific scenario never happens, it forces us to think about some very real issues about power democracy and the kind of future we're building. So listener, what do you think? Is this fictional world a warning sign or just something to think about? We'll leave you to ponder that until our next deep dive.